Hey, what's happening, guys? What's going on YouTube? You guys have tuned into Rules for Rebels, and in today's video, I wanted to talk a little bit about remote work. Saw a recent article and a study by a company called T-Sheets, which is actually a QuickBooks partner, and they have kind of a time tracking and a scheduling app that a lot of people use for remote workers. They did an article on are remote workers actually working, and it was kind of a survey that asked employers as well as employers who have remote workers, as well as employees who work remotely. Kind of asked them like how much time during a day do they spend on personal tasks. Do they feel like they're more productive? Do the employers feel like their employees are more productive? So that's what I wanted to talk about in today's video. I figured we kind of cover this article, talk a little bit about remote work. And I'd be curious to hear from any of you guys. Are any of you guys remote workers? If so, like, what has your experience been like? Would you recommend it to others? Do you feel like you're more productive? Do you spend a lot of time doing personal tasks, whether it be taking a dog for a walk, doing laundry, whatever else? I thought this would be an interesting topic for a couple reasons. First off, a lot of you guys are already entrepreneurs. Maybe some of you guys already have employees. But I know a lot of you guys are aiming to or have goals to be an entrepreneur. And at some point, you're probably going to be hiring employees. And there's this kind of very, what's the word I'm looking for? This kind of very kind of like old world thinking that, people need to be in an office for 8 hours a day in order for you to get your money's worth out of them. And there are jobs out there, brick and mortar locations. If you're working at a restaurant, if you're working retail, if you're working security, there's a lot of talk these days about 4-day work weeks or, 6-hour work days, things like that. And there are some jobs out there that it's just not going to work, right? If you have a brick and mortar location, you're open from 9 to 5, somebody has to be there from 9 to 5. But for most kind of more office jobs, more professional jobs, it's really more about productivity than it is hours put in. And I'm sure, if for anybody who spends time on Reddit, like everybody on Reddit is always talking about how they're at work or they're supposed to be working and they're spending all their time on Reddit. You hear a lot of people say, oh, out of an 8-hour day, I might put in 2 hours of actual work. And even those people who do work hard, I think a lot of people, time's wasted on stupid meetings in offices or, it's just in some ways, it's almost impossible to be completely focused for a full 8 hours a day. A lot of people can finish all their work in 4 or 5 hours and they just spend the rest of the day looking busy. So I think it's very antiquated, the idea that people need to be sitting in a chair for 8 hours a day to get paid. I think the challenge is, and I don't even really think that being in an office really adds that much. A lot of people say, oh, well, it fosters an environment of teamwork or collaboration. People can, get in contact with their colleagues and their coworkers easier. I've been kind of doing some freelance contracting in some different offices and for some different e-commerce companies. And something that I've seen and something that really kind of blows my mind. And I've brought it up to my girlfriend, my sister, like some other people I know who work in offices. And I said, the thing that's absolutely crazy to me is even in like an open office environment where everybody can look at and see one another, people don't actually walk up to each other and talk to each other. People don't actually have face-to-face conversations. People will, like, somebody could literally be sitting next to you and you'll instant message them or dial them on the phone and talk to them on the phone, even though they're literally 3 feet away from you and you could turn to your left and look them in the face and talk to them. So I feel like a lot of the, quote unquote benefits that a lot of people push for reasons for everybody being in an office together, I feel like a lot of those benefits people don't even take advantage of or just aren't necessary, because even when people are all working in an office together, everybody's doing everything digital these days, whether, it's in some, inter-office, proprietary like IM system or Google Hangouts or whatever else. And I am starting to notice more larger companies kind of taking advantage of remote work. Remote work means a lot of studies find that people working remotely are more productive. But beyond that, you don't need an office. You don't need to buy coffee for the office. You don't, all these expenses that come along, rent, the shared office space fees, electricity, all this stuff that you'd otherwise be paying for to house people in an office, you no longer have those expenses. So I've actually seen a lot of remote work companies, and you're starting to see a lot of bigger companies. It tends to be a lot of digital companies like TaxJar and others, but you're starting to see more, and you're starting to see more and more, even like larger mainstream like Fortune 500 companies are starting to kind of be open and starting to hire remote workers. And some of the cool things about this, remote workers for a professional job oftentimes still get full benefits. A lot of times you might get like a home office, like almost per diem, where they'll give you $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 to, pretty much set up a home office for yourself. So, get yourself a desk, get yourself a computer, whatever else. I figured in a second here, I'd take you guys over. There's a lot of different sites like this. This is one site called We Work Remotely, and, Google, Basecamp, Amazon. Let's see if there's any other. Do they list the companies? IRL, MetaLab. Of course, as soon as I say it's companies you're going to recognize, we're not going to see any ones. But Property Meld, I believe that's like a SaaS software. That's a property management software. That's one I've heard of before. Normally, you find a lot of like Shopify apps and SaaS services and things like that. Loom Deodorant, TaxJar. TaxJar is a big company. Growth Machine, DataQuest, Hotjar. Hotjar is another big one. Piggy. Let's see, what else do we got here? I'll link to this site in the description box below if you guys want to check it out and kind of look for some remote work. But like I said, a lot of you guys are entrepreneurs. A lot of you, some of you guys may already employ people. A lot of you guys will employ people in the future, and you can kind of play a role in kind of shaping the future workspace and getting rid of this kind of antiquated idea that people need to Follow Up Boss. I've actually used them before. That people actually need a GitHub, another big one. That people actually need to VIP Kid. I guess that's just a work from home English teacher, but you get the point. You guys can kind of shape the future of the American or the modern workspace, and kind of maybe help to kind of get rid of this idea that people need to be sitting in a chair for 8 hours a day to be productive. So yeah, let's just kind of get right on into this article. Are remote workers actually working? Survey asks employers and employees to weigh in on remote workers' performance and productivity. The article goes on to say, when it comes to answering the question, are remote workers actually working? It's easy to hear some of the skepticism behind the text. Working from home often comes with its own set of air quotes, like it's code for hanging out or watching Netflix. But is that skepticism deserved, or are remote workers getting a bad rap? To get a clearer picture of remote workers and their habits, T-Sheets followed up a 2018 survey of remote employees with a 2019 survey of remote workers and their employers. In addition to asking how remote workers spend their time on the clock, we asked about productivity, performance, and perceptions. And one thing I will say about remote workers, it's not necessarily the workers who have a hard time staying on task. What I found when I worked, when I ran my own, even when I ran my own business, I pretty much went into the office Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. But I have been self-employed working out of the house before. And one thing that's kind of hard to get across to like friends and family members is everybody seems to think that because you don't go in an office, that either that you don't actually work, or that you just have the freedom to run around doing whatever all day. And it's funny, my dad worked remotely, or worked from a home office for probably the last 7 or 10 years of his career. And, he would always be ranting to people. Like, my mom would be like, oh, could you pick me up from the airport? Or, could you go do this? Or, this handyman's going to come by the house. Could you? And, my dad was always saying, I don't just sit around here watching Judge Mathis, I actually do have to work. And it's kind of funny, years later, my folks were living in Charleston, so they come back and forth between Chicago quite often. And my dad would always ask me, oh, can you pick me up from the airport? Can you take me to the airport? And I thought it was kind of funny that, years earlier, he was always one ranting about, I have to work, I have things to do. And, now that I'm self-employed or working out of the house or whatever, he's kind of treating me the same way, like I don't have things to do all day. So I think that's one of the challenges of remote workers is letting your spouse, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your brother, your sister, your friends know that, no, you can't run around all day long doing things for them, doing tasks for them, meeting handymen, driving them to the airport. You do work even though you work from home. But the article goes on to say working from home might mean walking the dog. When asked if they've ever done outside work or tasks inside of work hours, remote workers answered honestly, absolutely. Just 23% of respondents said they never spend their remote work day doing personal tasks. So 23% of people say they never do laundry, they never are meal prepping, like they're spending their time working. 64% said they sometimes take care of a personal task during a workday. So we got a majority there. and another 13% said they always have something personal to get done well on the clock. And you know what? I think that's one of the fears employers have. I think part of it is just like, if I can have you, if I'm paying you 40 grand a year, 50 grand a year, whatever it may be, and I can have you stuck in the office for 8 hours a day, I can see how it's kind of a hard sell to an employer to be like, hey, look, pay me the same amount of money, but only let me, I guess kind of shorter work days is different than remote work. But, I think a lot of it does tie in that we should be focused on productivity and what needs to be done and what's getting done versus the amount of time somebody sits in a chair. Because somebody can sit in a chair for 8 hours a day and get absolutely nothing done, whereas somebody else could work from home for 3 hours a day and be 2 or 3 times, more productive than the person who's sitting in an office chair for 8 hours a day. But I think it's a tough sell to employers to be like, look, pay them the same amount of money, but let them only work 4 hours a day if they can get their work done for 4 hours. Right? It's tough to get somebody to open their pocketbook and do that when ultimately at the end of the day, if the work that they need to get done is getting done, what do they really care whether you spent 5 hours on it or 9 hours on it, right? And then one other thing I kind of wanted to touch on that I meant to kind of put in the intro here is, oh shit, I forgot. I'm going to have to pause and catch my thoughts. Okay, got it. So another thing I wanted to mention about remote work, entrepreneurship has become a big trend, a big fad. Everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. And I think a lot of people truly love entrepreneurship. A lot of people truly love business. They love creating things. They love solving problems. But I would bet you that probably 70% plus, maybe even higher than that, of quote unquote entrepreneurs, people interested in entrepreneurship, I would venture to guess 70, 80% of those people really don't care that much about entrepreneurship. They just don't want to work for somebody else, or they don't want to work under the constraints of having to be in an office from 9 to 5. And entrepreneurship seems like the best route to get there. And so that's what they choose to do. But they're not necessarily, their skill sets don't necessarily align with entrepreneurship. They're not necessarily passionate or interested about an entrepreneurship. It's just like, I want to work from home, or I want to have more flexibility over my schedule. And they just choose entrepreneurship as a way to get there. But I think for a lot of people, I think remote work may be a good option. A lot of remote jobs kind of have flex time to, there are some remote jobs where you need to be available between 8 and 5. And you'll see if you look at We Work Remotely, you'll see a lot of these jobs, will say, oh, you have to be available between 9 and 5 Australian time or US time or, mountain time or whatever it may be. Because a lot of the remote jobs are doing like help desk type stuff for Shopify apps and SaaS services. But there's a lot of remote jobs where that pretty much offer you kind of like a flex schedule where if you want to work from 12 at night till 8 in the morning, you can work then, whenever, as long as you get your stuff done, that's all that they really care about. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to throw remote work out there. Is like, if you're somebody who's getting into entrepreneurship, not really because you're all about entrepreneurship, but just because you want a little bit more freedom and control over your schedule or your lifestyle, like remote work might be something that you should look into. So carrying on with this article, well, they are working remotely. The majority of these employees are also taking care of a few personal errands, whether it be picking up the kids from school in the afternoon, taking the dog for a walk around midday. When asked how much time they spend on personal tasks, remote workers fessed up about that too. And we'll get into those stats in a minute. But one thing I just wanted to throw out there, I don't even necessarily think there's anything wrong with somebody breaking up their workday. A buddy of mine, Jared, who you guys have actually met or seen, he was the copywriter on the interview I did with a working copywriter. And he had kind of turned me on. I'd already kind of naturally worked this way, and this is just kind of how I work best. But he turned me on to, I think it was the copywriter. But this guy, he works in 30-minute blocks of time. So he'll work for 30 minutes, and then he'll take 10 minutes off, 15 minutes off, 30 minutes off, go for a walk, work out, do some other task, and then go back to his work. And he found that he just can't be productive working in longer than 30-minute blocks of time. And I think a lot of times in offices, everybody is kind of forced to kind of acclimate to whatever the quote-unquote normal style of work is. But I think there's a lot of people who would much, even if you wind up working an hour or two extra per day, I think there's a lot of people who would prefer to work in blocks of time and then take take some time off to go for a walk or do whatever else. And, when I had my office with my partner, I would probably get up 3 to 4 times before lunch and 3 to 4 times after lunch and either walk over to the gas station and grab a drink, go sit out back and just kind of sit in the sunshine for a little bit, take a walk. And even though, I am kind of quote unquote wasting some time doing those things, that was, the way that I was the most productive. But getting back to kind of the stats, let's see, 30% said they spend 30 minutes a day doing personal tasks during work, while 39% said they spent an hour or more on such errands. So 30% of people said they spent about 30 minutes a day. Almost 40% of people said they spent an hour a day on personal tasks and errands. But here's the thing, taking a little time to exercise Fido or enjoy a long lunch isn't uninspected. In fact, employers of remote workers thought their employees were spending much more time doing personal tasks. 70% of employers said they thought their remote workers were sometimes taking care of personal tasks while on the clock, and nearly 25% said they estimated the time to be about 2 hours a day. So, employers of remote workers are actually expecting employees to kind of take more leeway and waste more time than they actually do. And that's one other thing about remote work. Something that you'll hear from a lot of remote workers is that it's almost this exact thing playing out. A lot of remote workers almost feel the need to prove themselves. If you go into a job, if somebody sees you sitting in your desk all day, you can fuck around on Reddit for 6 hours a day, and your boss or manager or whoever still sees you sitting in that chair. So you almost have less incentive to work hard. Whereas when somebody's working remotely, they almost feel the need to prove themselves or justify what they're doing with their time. So one thing that's actually kind of a negative, but one thing you'll hear from a lot of remote workers is that they actually wind up putting in well more than 8 hours a day, or they find themselves under constant stress to kind of prove that they're adding value and participating and putting in their full workday and doing what they need to be doing. So the article goes on to say, so what's going on here? If bosses know the remote employees aren't always working, why not call back the troops? What's keeping employers from demanding their remote workers stop wasting time? And here we have a chart. Time remote workers say they spend on personal tasks versus time the bosses think they spend on personal tasks. So, as you can see here, so the employers are in the purple, the employees are in the blue. And as you can see, the employees actually spend a lot less time on personal tasks or not working than their employers actually think they are. Working from home might mean I'm more productive. Say 2 employees are both scheduled to work 40-hour weeks. One employee works all 40 hours and accomplishes his or her to-do list. The other employee only spends 20 hours on work but also accomplishes his or her entire to-do list. There's no difference in quality. Should bosses take disciplinary action against employees who did their work in half the time? And I think a lot of employers would feel like, well, if you could do all your work in 20 hours, maybe we need to give you more work. But I think at some point, I think there's only so much output of energy somebody can output. I think there's only so many tasks that somebody can be accomplished. And I think somebody working very focused doing something in a shorter period of time is somebody who takes a longer time. I think all things are kind of equal there. I think if that person who finished their work in 20 hours was given more work, I think the quality of their work would suffer, or I think they'd have a harder time staying on task. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, if everything you need to get done is getting done, what do you really care how much time somebody spends doing it? The article goes on to say, for most employers of remote workers, the answer is a resounding no, and remote workers know it. When asked how their boss would rate their productivity, 74% of remote employees said they know their boss thinks they are productive. Only half, 54%, said they would rate their work performance as above average compared to their coworkers. And let's see, what do we got here? 59% of employers would rate the remote workers' performance as above average. 5% would rate their performance as below average. And I assume that means the other, 46% or whatever that is, assumes that, pretty much all things are equal between remote workers and workers in an office. Bosses answered similarly, though they weren't entirely as confident as their remote employees. When asked about the remote workers' productivity, 54% of bosses rated their remote employees as highly productive, while 41% of their remote workers could be more productive. But what is productivity compared to performance? Well, just over half of remote workers felt their performance was above average. Nearly 60% of employers felt the same. So employers actually felt that remote workers were more productive than they actually thought they were themselves. In total, 59% of employers said they would rate their remote workers' performance as above average compared to their other employees. So, well over half say that remote workers are more productive than in-house workers or in-office workers. Let's see how remote workers rate their performance versus how bosses rate their performance. So employees actually rated themselves less productive than their employers thought they were. Working from home doesn't mean working without consequences. If there's one thing we learned from our remote workers campaign, it's that no one's pulling the wool over the boss's eyes. Whether they make it known to the remote workers or not, most employers are well aware of that employees working from home aren't locking themselves inside their home office. Still, every relationship built on trust has its limits, and it's important that remote workers know those limits for the good of everyone involved. When asked about trusting relationships, 72% of remote employees said they believe their boss trusts them to work independently. Similarly, 3 out of 5 said they've never had to justify their work when working remotely. For bosses, the answers were a little bit different, but still positive. 99% of employers said they sometimes or always trust their remote employees to work independently. That's 26 percentage points higher than remote workers answered. What's more, bosses understand a lot of the more subtle challenges remote workers have, completing their duties outside of the office. For instance, 31% of remote workers said the thing they miss the most about working in an office was social interaction. 14% said they didn't feel they were part of a team. And I think that is, that's kind of weird. So I think a lot of people would argue that by having people work in an office and seeing their colleagues every day, that there's a little bit more of a cohesive team feel, and that's better for productivity and teamwork and collaboration and everything else. Although one thing I've noticed is a lot of these companies who have remote workers, they put a lot of time and effort and a big focus on creating a team atmosphere. So that could be a weekly call. A lot of these companies, once or twice a year, will have a big team outing where everybody either heads to the corporate office or goes on a vacation together, and kind of fosters that, that team environment that otherwise could be missed out on. Let's see. To combat that sense of loss, 60% of employers said they pay for their remote workers to have collaborative tools like Slack or Teams. 60% said they also pay for their remote employees' internet service, which is good because slow internet was the top complaint for 13% of remote employees. What employers or remote workers typically pay for? Okay, so and I was going to get into this as well. So if you have a remote job, typically your phone bill is going to be covered by your employer, your internet service, collaboration tools, if you're working in like SEO, like something like SEMrush or Moz, office supplies, and computers. So a lot of these companies will give you computers. A lot of them will give you a generous home office allowance. Working from home doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. In some ways, remote workers are just like any other employee. They have occasional bouts of unproductivity. They have their own struggles and measures of success. 17% said they get overlooked for promotions, while 11% said they sometimes get left out of the decision-making process. Feelings all workers have had at some point or another. If you are going to get a remote job, remote jobs are great, and they're in high demand. So take what you can get, right? But I feel like I know a lot of people who do remote work. I talk to a lot of people who do remote work, and I do think that there's, what's the word I'm looking for? Your fellow employees, your colleagues who have to go into the office are going to kind of have something against you. They're going to be kind of jealous of you. A lot of times they may have a better relationship with the boss. They may be more of a part of decision-making processes. So if at all possible, it's probably better to get a remote job with a company that's entirely remote. And there are a ton of companies out there that are like that. Like I said, TaxJar and others have 100% remote workforce. Let's see, where do we leave off? Remote workers also aren't blind to how others might see them or how they might improve their performance. 1 in 3 felt a more structured workday could improve productivity. 1 in 5 felt a dedicated home office would do the same. Employers looking to help their remote employees make the most of their time on a clock, be it at home or somewhere else, should not be afraid of asking these individuals how they might be more productive. Then challenge them to make that change and report results. Performance and perception aside, it's important to remember that when it comes to remote employees, one size does not fit all. Of the employees we surveyed, just 27% said they worked remotely full-time, and 73% split their time between in-office and out-of-office environments. 1 in 3 had a dedicated home office, while 1 in 4 did not, but still worked at home. 15% said they worked at a client's home, while nearly the same number reported working from a variety of locations. And we got a chart here where remote workers are working from. So we got a home office, which is 31%. We got home, at home without an office, so on your bed, on your couch, 26%. Coffee shop, 3%. Rented office space, I think that would be like a co-working space, 6%. Oh, I guess that wasn't. I guess that was renting your own office. Co-working space, 3%. Wherever, 14%. And job site or a client's home, 2%. Let's see, what else do we got here? Well, having a dedicated home office might be the solution. One remote worker needs to be more focused for another. Such an arrangement may not be possible. That's why it's important employers look at the remote worker arrangements on a case-by-case basis and avoid blanket policies that could ostracize otherwise exemplary employees. Working from home does not mean working. We asked the remote workers and employers of remote workers about the habits of such employees, and they had a lot to say. Even though both groups said such employees weren't working all the time, neither group felt that was the only relevant response. So whether you're the employer of a remote worker or an employee who works remotely, take heart. There will always be those who surround working from home with an air of skepticism, but as long as the work gets done and done well, who cares if someone's walking their dog? So I thought that was an interesting survey. I'd love to kind of hear from some of you guys who are remote workers, like how do your habits and how do your work habits stack up against kind of this article and kind of the general populaces. Yeah, I guess that's all I really got for you guys today. I'll link to this article as well as We Work Remotely. If any of you guys are curious about more job boards for remote work, there's a ton of them out there. I think Flex Jobs is one. I believe that one costs like $15 a month. But there's a ton of job boards out there like this. There's also email services where you sign up and like every day or once a week, they'll send out a list of companies looking to hire remote workers. But like I said, if you guys become employers, I think remote workers are definitely something that you should consider. And for those of you guys who are maybe in entrepreneurship more for the freedom and flexibility over your time and schedule than you are kind of for the love of the hustle or the love of entrepreneurship, remote work might be something that you want to look into. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If so, give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to the channel, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and I'll catch you guys on the next video, guys, later.